A cloud hides the sky. A nuclear shadow falls across the human future. Midway through the 20th century, two superpowers prepared for a conflict which might have ended life on the planet. Spring flowers, the warm light of day, the pleasures of life. But under this American hotel was a hidden gate. It led into an underworld. This was the shelter for members of the United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. Down here, the politicians would represent the dead and the dying in the world overhead. For a handful of human beings, there was all they needed to wait out the nuclear winter. But nerves might snap, then order would be kept by force. The lost world above the shelter would become only a memory, a myth. The living would come to envy the dead. Berlin, 1945. Soviet troops had stormed the capital of Hitler's Reich. American, British, and French soldiers soon joined them in the ruins. Churchill, Stalin, and Truman were the official victors of the Second World War, but a special triumph was Stalin's. Russian power had pushed forward into the center of Europe. At Potsdam, outside Berlin, the Big Three met to settle the post-war order. Winston Churchill represented a Britain exhausted by war, while Joseph Stalin, supreme ruler of the Soviet Union, faced Harry S. Truman, 33rd President of the United States. It was 3 months after the death of President Franklin Roosevelt that Harry Truman, once a Missouri haberdasher, set off for Potsdam. It was his first overseas conference as head of state.
President Truman was unprepared for the presidency in the sense of being fully briefed and up to the minute on all that was going on. But as a senator for the past 10 years, as chairman of one of the most important congressional committees of the war, he was well aware of the major problems that a president had to face.
Stalin was late for the conference. He had a sort of heart attack. Anyhow, he came one day later. He visited Churchill and Truman and immediately apologized for being late.
The Soviet Union was devastated by war. But Stalin remained a formidable figure.
I went up to him and I said, "Marshal, this must be a great satisfaction to you after all the trials that you've been through and the tragedy that you've been through to be here in Berlin." And he looked at me and said, "Tsar Alexander got to Paris."
Did Stalin want to push on to the Atlantic? Lenin, his predecessor, once hoped the Russian Revolution would lead on to communist world revolution. It was then, after the First World War, in a clash of ideologies, communist and capitalist, that the Cold War had its origins. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson took ship to the European Peace Conference with his gospel for a better world, safe for small nations, sound for business. But his peace settlement excluded Bolshevik Russia. Many nations, including the United States and Britain, sent troops to fight the Russian Revolution. Churchill, fresh from victory over Germany, urged, "Kill the Bolshevik, kiss the Hun." The intervention left Lenin and Stalin convinced that the West would seize any chance, embrace any ally, in order to destroy communism.
I joined the Civil War as a so-called son of the regiment. We were young boys. We knew we were fighting for the people, the poor people.
There was widespread support for the Red Army. The foreign troops soon withdrew. The Bolshevik Reds defeated the Whites, their Russian enemies.
The White Guards, who had left Russia, were encircling us. There was starvation. It was a time when sausages were made from human flesh.
In Russia, famine followed civil war. The victorious Bolsheviks turned away from the outside world to build up the economy at home. America also turned inwards. People wanted the good life and no more foreign entanglements. Then, in 1929, Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression began. Suddenly, across the richest nation on earth, millions faced destitution. American politics shifted to the left.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Roosevelt promised a new deal for Americans. He would manage capitalism for the public good. And in a change of policy, he recognized the Soviet Union.
One has to remember that we had been, I think, for 16 years without any representation in Russia. No relations between the two governments. And FDR was the one who decided to try to break that logjam.
Stalin's industrial drive soon attracted American experts. Some brought their families. While Soviet muscles strained to raise dams and blast furnaces, American corporations supplied skilled engineers on contract. Communist ideology didn't worry them. Unlike the Russians, they were free to go when the job was over. Stalin was master of the economic plan. a tyrant who tolerated no failure and no criticism. Privately owned fields became collectivized prairies. The cost of collectivization was the murder of millions of peasants and renewed famine. The truth was kept secret.
People didn't really know all about the bad things. All the achievements were put down to his initiatives. Those who knew otherwise would shut up. They knew if they said anything, they would be imprisoned and shot. It was a regime of terror.
This was socialism in one country. Heavy industry's output doubled in 10 years.
Stalin felt that in order to get public support for the things he was doing, which were very harsh policies, he had to convince a great many of the people, the common people and the party members, that Russia was confronted with a conspiracy on the part of the major capitalist powers to undermine the Soviet government by espionage.
Lenin's old comrades confessed to imaginary crimes.
Игра разоблачена, маска предательства с их облика, с их лиц сорвана и сорвана раз и навсегда. Пусть прогремит ваш приговор, как освежающая и всеочищающая гроза справедливого.
I could see them there with their pale faces, their twitching lips, their evasive eyes. These were the faces of men who had been, if not tortured, then terrified in many ways, and often by threats to take it out on their families if they didn't confess.
The Moscow trials tore away some foreign illusions. Stalin's Soviet Union was revealed as a police state, not a workers' paradise. But even in America, thousands stayed loyal to the communist dream. In the 1930s, Moscow called for a popular front of the left against Hitler and fascism.
Within the shadow of the giant skyscrapers, the red cohorts of communism gather at historic Madison Square.
Fighting the spread of fascism became the great cause for socialist and communist alike. Doubts about Stalin were repressed. In Spain, volunteers from all over the world rallied to oppose the fascist rebellion launched by Franco. Franco was armed by Mussolini and Hitler. In Germany, the Nazis were rearming. Hitler did not hide his ambitions to dominate Europe and then the world.
Sein Sowjetzeichen soll vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen!
Roosevelt wanted to keep out of any European war.
Despite what happens in continents overseas, the United States of America shall and must remain as long ago the father of our country prayed that it might remain, unentangled and free.
Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, trusted that Hitler would listen to reason.
When I was a little boy, I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try, try, try again.
In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Munich. war seemed close as Germany prepared to invade Czechoslovakia. But Chamberlain went determined to appease Hitler. At Munich, Britain, France and Italy licensed Hitler to seize the Czech Sudetenland with its German minority. Czechoslovakia's allies had abandoned her. In Moscow, Stalin drew lessons from Munich. The Western democracies, he concluded, would never stand up to Hitler. Stalin planned a desperate stroke of diplomacy. The fascist and communist arch-enemies were about to embrace. Hitler flew his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to Moscow. The Nazi-Soviet pact was signed by Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. The West was appalled.
After the pact was signed, I heard this from Stalin's lips. He was often at our home. He said, "We need to win time, at least 2 years' time. Only then will the Soviet Union be able to defend itself against Germany."
September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on the aggressor. Too late to save Poland. Defeated, Poland was wiped off the map. Germany and Russia had conspired against her. In eastern Poland, the communist occupiers were supervised by Nikita Khrushchev. They were taking over provinces once ruled by the Tsars. The Nazi-Soviet pact left Stalin free to grab Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Baltic states were back under Russian domination. Stalin had already outraged the world by invading Finland.
The Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. It has allied itself with another dictatorship, and it has invaded a neighbor so infinitesimally small that it could do no conceivable possible harm to the Soviet Union.
In 1940, Hitler struck west. By mid-1941, France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Denmark, Yugoslavia and Greece had been added to his conquests. Churchill's Britain held out alone. On June the 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. It was a day that changed history. Hitler meant to win a vast colony for Germany. Instead, his act would bring Russian power into the heart of Europe only 4 years later. The future outlines of the Cold War began to form as the Nazi tanks surged forward. The Red Army fell back in retreat.
My mother said, "Go with the soldiers." The soldiers were retreating, injured, covered in blood. I only had my overcoat and my shoes, that's all.
Soviet citizens rallied. Abroad, the Soviet Union won unexpected friends.
Churchill, in spite of his past anti-Soviet feelings, at once welcomed Stalin's Russia as an ally. He did say to his friends, of course, that he'd have welcomed the devil if the devil had turned up in order to help him defeat Hitler.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
America declared war on Japan. Days later, with the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, Hitler rashly declared war on the United States, making Russians and Americans allies. The German thrust at Moscow was blocked. Stalin broadcast to the nation.
И эти люди, лишенные совести и чести, люди с моралью животных, имеют наглость призывать к уничтожению великой русской нации. Немецкие захватчики хотят иметь истребительную войну с народом мира. Что же, если немцы хотят иметь истребительную войну, они ее получат.
Stalin already looked beyond victory. He told the British that post-war Soviet boundaries must include the Baltic states and part of Poland.
When I went to Moscow with Anthony Eden in December 1941, when the Germans were still only 19 kilometers away from us as we talked, the very first thing that Stalin said at that meeting was, Mr. Eden, I want to have your assurance that at the end of the war you will support my just claim to all these areas, you see. And Eden was able to take the back. He said, but oughtn't we to be thinking about how we win the war? No, said Stalin, I would like to have this clear at the very beginning. So Eden obviously had to say, but he had no authority to discuss how the war was to end.
American aid to Russia concentrated on guns and trucks. But Stalin and his people cried out for more, a second front, an Allied landing in Western Europe to relieve Soviet suffering.
I saw the atrocities. I heard the noises of war. Although it's 50 years ago, I can still hear the noises of war. The shells, the bombing, people screaming, women crying.
For 6 months, battle raged at Stalingrad. Hitler sent 500,000 men. The Germans were trapped and forced to surrender. The tide of war was turning. Western opinion cheered on the Red Army, their comrades in arms.
The Russians have thus far lost in the common cause at least 50% more men killed, wounded, and missing than all the rest of the European allies put together. And moreover, they have killed, wounded, and captured at least 20 times as many Germans as the rest of the allies.
The Nazis sought ways to split the alliance against them. At Katyn in western Russia, they dug up the corpses of more than 4,000 Polish officers. Germany announced, truthfully as it turned out, that the officers had been murdered by Soviet security troops in 1940. Britain and America chose to ignore this evidence of Stalin's methods. In 1943, with their alliance still intact, the Big Three prepared to meet at Tehran in Persia.
I was summoned to Tehran to help them prepare for the conference. Mr. Roosevelt is supposed to arrive. We had the code names for it. And so I called the airfield, and sure enough, I spoke to Admiral Leahy. I said, "Are you coming?" And he said, "No, we're not coming. We're going to American mission." And when I said that to Molotov, I thought he'd just fry me alive. I said, "What?" And he'd get all the four-letter words I never heard in my life were spilled over me. He said, "Who the hell are you here anyway? Who How'd you get in here? What do you know? What am I going to say to Stalin?
Stalin persuaded Roosevelt that his safety was best assured by residence at the Soviet embassy. The embassy had been specially prepared for his visit. It was bugged.
Иосиф Виссарионович мне сказал, что задачи, которые он ставит...
Stalin told me that the task he was putting to our group, and particularly to me, was ethically very unattractive. However, the position of the USSR was so serious that he had to know what our allies were thinking.
Stalin was very skillful in dealing with Roosevelt and Churchill. Even Churchill began to quite like him, you know, and talk about Uncle Joe, which was a quite affectionate term. And they both had this idea that if you treated him the right way, the phrase was, if you treat Uncle Joe like a member of our club, perhaps one day he will behave like a member of our club.
Every day, at 8 in the morning, I had to go to Stalin. I went with all the transcripts, in Russian and in English. For about an hour, Stalin examined, in great detail, all of Roosevelt's conversations.
Выяснял все детали разговоров, которые вел Рузвельт.
I don't think FDR was capable of conceiving of a man of such profound iniquity, coupled with enormous strategic cleverness, as Stalin. He had never met such a creature. And Stalin was an excellent actor, quiet, affable, reasonable. He sent them all away thinking this really is a great leader.
The Allies agreed that post-war Eastern Europe would be a Soviet zone of influence. Stalin would annex Eastern Poland. As compensation, the Poles would get a slice of Eastern Germany. Poland was offered no choice. Together, the Big Three mapped out the future. D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, the biggest seaborne invasion in history, lands in France. This was the second front Stalin longed for. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies continued to advance.
Nazi rode back out of Russia. Every rail line blown up as they flee. Of course, Nazi propaganda now stresses the masterful retreat. The Soviet flag unfurled in triumph over Sani, Tarnopol, Odessa, as the Russian tide of victory rolls westward toward Germany.
As the Red Army approached Warsaw, the Polish resistance seized the city from the Germans. The Poles hoped to liberate themselves and confront Stalin with an independent Poland.
The Polish Home Army rose to take over Warsaw when the Germans left and before the Russians arrived. And the Russians had encouraged them to do this. And then the Russian army stopped on the Vistula.
Stalin claimed that his armies needed to pause outside Warsaw and regroup. The Germans counterattacked.
Polish freedom fighters were abandoned by the Russians, who were sitting with their forces across the river and could easily have gone in to help them. I thought for various reasons that that was the point at which American policy should have changed.
The Poles held out alone against the Germans for 63 days. When the Rising collapsed in slaughter and Warsaw was destroyed, Poland blamed the Soviet Union. Then, with Poland under Soviet occupation, Churchill and Stalin got down to power broking in Moscow. One night, Churchill scribbled down a formula for carving up Europe. Romania, Soviet influence 90%. Greece, 90% British and American. Yugoslavia and Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 75% Russian. Stalin ticked his agreement. Churchill wondered if the note should be destroyed. Stalin told him, "No, you keep it." Yalta in the Crimea. Churchill wanted the next Big Three meeting to be held in the West, but Stalin insisted on a Soviet meeting place.
Stalin wanted to please them. And I will tell you, I only saw how hard people worked with everything devastated around, bringing crystal glass, bringing white napkins and tablecloths and furniture. Even when Mr. Winston Churchill said once, "Oh, I wish I had a lemon with my gin and tonic," the next day they found a lemon tree.
The journey was torment for the sick Roosevelt. His polio and the strains of war leadership dragged him down. In the former Tsar's palace, the leaders faced a heavy agenda. They must decide how to govern a defeated Germany, and they wanted to get the Polish question settled.
Eastern Europe, important though it was only one of many other things. First of all, winning the war and then occupying Germany. Secondly, seeing to the war against Japan. Thirdly, the post-war arrangements.
Stalin knew that the war was won. After all, the Russians were only 40 miles from Berlin at that time. They were on the point of capturing Budapest. They'd swept through parts of Eastern Europe, not the whole lot yet.
He was a very shrewd negotiator. He doesn't look you in the eye. He's just sort of smoking. He was a chain smoker. And he was just sort of smoking, and you think that probably he's not listening, Then all of a sudden, he would raise his fingers.
The terrible mistake that Roosevelt made was that he was trying to ingratiate himself into Stalin's favor by stressing the divisions between Churchill and himself. So he made it quite clear to Stalin that there were real divisions as well as imaginary ones.
For us, of course, the major topic was the future of Eastern Europe and above all Poland. And on that, Stalin obviously was bound to get what he wanted because the Red Army was in occupation of the whole area, including Poland. They'd already gone through Poland into Germany by the time we were in Yalta.
By now, the Balkans and most of Poland were in Soviet hands. So too was much of Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Battlefield facts that diplomacy could not alter.
We got at Yalta 2 diplomatic documents, which on paper were perfectly satisfactory. I mean, that there would be a coalition government in Poland, including people from the West, and there would be free elections in Poland. And then there was a declaration covering the whole of Eastern Europe called the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which again was to be rebuilt on the basis of democracy and free elections and all the rest of it. Of course, phrases which the Russian used but interpreted rather differently.
Stalin promised that the Polish elections would be free and fair. Tired of arguing, the others took him at his word. Germany would be governed jointly by the victorious Allies, and Stalin secretly pledged to join the war against Japan. Churchill was confident.
We have all bound ourselves to work together to make sure that there is increasing happiness and prosperity for the broad masses of the people in every land, no longer subject to the hard strains of war. There is the prospect which has now opened before us.
funeral special heads for Washington. An honor guard of servicemen keeps vigil beside the flag-draped casket. At villages, crossroads, way stations, the people who were so close to his heart stand silently, expressive of the devotion Franklin Roosevelt inspired.
As the president was buried, the last battles in Europe were ending. American troops were taking over German towns without resistance.
They were glad to see the American troops because they had a terrible fear of having Russians occupy or come into their area.
As the Allies advanced, they discovered the full horror of German crimes. The Jews had been the Nazis' special target, but every nation was mourning over mass graves. Fear of a German revival would overshadow the first years of peace. Soon, Soviet and American troops would meet in Germany.
Our lieutenant came in one day and said he wants to get the patrol together. We're going to go and see if we can find some Russians. Well, none of us were too eager to go on that patrol, really, because we realized the end of the war was imminent, and we didn't know what was out there. And, we had gotten this far. Why stick our necks out again?
We kept going, and we kept running into no resistance, and everybody was retiring and surrendering. And we just, I guess, were lucky we got to the Elbe River, and we saw the Russians on the other side.
I told my girlfriend, you stand there and I'll stay here. We waited for them to come ashore. We could see their faces. They looked like ordinary people. We had imagined something different. Well, they were Americans.
I guess we didn't know what to expect from the Russians, but when you looked at them and examined them, you couldn't tell whether, if you put an American uniform on them, they could have been American.
Когда встретились, как мы целовались с ними. Не знали, кого целуем. We didn't know who we were kissing. We were just kissing everyone.
I think that for us, the war was over. We washed our feet in the Elbe River. We washed our faces and hands. We thought that now we'd met the Americans, the war must be over.
Two days later, the movie cameras were ready. The moment of history, the meeting of ordinary soldiers from Russia and America, was rerun dramatically with a bigger cast. By Allied agreement, the capture of Berlin was left to the Russians. April 1945, the Red Army launches its final offensive towards Berlin. The war cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives. Nearly 40 times American and British losses put together. The red flag, destined to fly over the Reichstag, was a homemade affair.
We used tablecloths. One night I helped my friend, a Jewish tailor, sew them into 3 flags. We took them to Berlin. I found 3 soldiers and we climbed up. The first photograph I took was of the flag I'd brought from Moscow, the Soviet flag over Berlin.
As Hitler's Reich fell apart, hundreds gathered in San Francisco to found the United Nations organization. The Soviet delegation was led by the man who had signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, Molotov.
Молотов был очень нервно настроен.
Molotov was very nervous because he felt that the war is coming to an end. Victory would soon be here, and here he is in America. That's why every day he sent cables to Stalin. When may I return?
As the San Francisco meeting continued, news came of Germany's surrender.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
As the fighting stopped, the Soviet front line had cut Europe in two, from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The war in the Pacific dragged on. American Marines had stormed Iwo Jima. It was a foretaste of how difficult and bloody the final invasion of Japan might be. Potsdam in conquered Germany, site of the third Allied summit.
The attitude in Washington toward the Soviet Union had begun to change well before Potsdam. Storm signals were already flying.
Truman
declared officially and quite sharply that the declaration on Europe adopted at Yalta is not being carried out in some countries.
Которое было принято всеми в Крыму на конференции. Что в частности в некоторых странах
Governments are being set up, which the United States will not recognize.
Которые Америка не может признать.
I'd call the Potsdam Conference a bad-tempered conference, because apart from the ceremonial occasions, it was really very bad-tempered.
The Allies couldn't easily agree about a German peace treaty or on how to carry out agreements reached at Yalta. Stalin confirmed that his troops were ready for war with Japan. But the day before the conference, America had successfully tested an atomic bomb.
President Truman, after consulting with the British and with his own military advisors, decided that he would tell Stalin that we had a powerful new weapon without identifying it as a nuclear weapon.
Truman repeated what he was saying about the new weapon. He thought Stalin didn't hear or didn't understand him. Stalin said, "Okay, thank you for the information."
There was some question amongst the Americans as to whether Stalin had really understood what Truman was saying. As we now know, they knew all about the Manhattan Project through espionage and their own agents.
With the conference still in session, news arrived from London that Clement Attlee had been elected British Prime Minister.
Мне показалось, что наибольшей сенсацией для Сталина...
I had a feeling that the biggest sensation for Molotov and Stalin was not the bomb explosion, but the fact that Churchill was not re-elected in England.
Another photo call. The world must see that the Allies were still united. On August the 2nd, the conference ended and the statesmen went home. 4 days later, America dropped an atomic bomb on the city and people of Hiroshima. Three days after that, another was dropped on Nagasaki. Soon the human race would be able to destroy itself in a day. At each Cold War crisis to come, the nuclear shadow threatened. Fulton, Missouri, a quiet little town in the Midwest. Not much has changed since 1946. Less than a year since the war had ended, the flags were up to welcome Winston Churchill. But he came to Fulton bringing a somber message for the world.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
The speech was not well received in the United States. It was thought to be too tough a speech. And the president was criticized by some for having Churchill over. Just goes to show how history changes. Now it's one of the great speeches that's ever been made because it helped warn the world about the danger of the Soviet aggrandizement.
Back from overseas came the Americans. For the second time in a century, the United States had been pulled into a world war far from its own shores. "300,000 Americans never came home. But the rest returned to a country wealthier and happier than ever before."
I sort of eased back into contentment. I said, gee, this is wonderful. People seem to have a little cushion of money now, which back in the Depression years, no one had any money. You just had about enough money to put food on the table and put a roof over your head and keep your insurance policy in effect,
Before the war, we had 15%, maybe sometimes more, unemployed, and a very stagnant, unhappy economy. And the war production of munitions, production of armaments, put enormous sums of money into the economy, put millions of people to work, not only men but women, Rosie the Riveter, and we emerged from the war with virtual full employment.
As soon as the war was over, the factories, they realized, hey, the Americans have been without a car since before the war. Let's get back into automobile production. And of course, the people were anxious for automobile. There was gasoline available, foodstuffs became available. So the economy definitely was on the rise.
War and the post-war rush to spend put American capitalism back on its wheels. In the first summer of peace, the Soviet soldiers rode home. They were awed to find themselves still alive.
До Москвы уже совсем недалеко. Поезд идет из столицы Германии. И вот он, счастливый час. Здравствуй, родная Москва! Здравствуйте, герои-победители!
In the crowds that welcomed them, it was the lucky ones who found their sons or husbands. Some 27 million Soviet civilians and soldiers did not live to see this day.
И целовали людей незнакомых, радовались. Это было большое ликование.
We met the soldiers with flowers, bread, anything we could get hold of.
Душевный подъем. Люди, какая-то надежда появилась, что кто-то еще, кто может быть.
We kissed complete strangers. We were so happy.
Известно, где он, потому что были же.
Our spirits were rising. We even dared hope that those who had gone missing might still be alive.
Очень надеялись, что, может быть, они найдут родных, что, может быть, это ошибка.
The whole of Russia had been destroyed. Everything from the borders to Moscow lay in ruins. There were lots of people with no homes to go to.
Where the Germans had passed, nearly 70,000 villages had been destroyed. Cities lay in rubble. Stalin's pre-war achievements, the factories and apartment blocks of the 5-year plans, had been wrecked by the invaders.
Things which before the war hadn't seemed too bad were completely destroyed. People were living in ruins. It's impossible to describe the suffering. You can only understand it if you've lived through it and seen it with your own eyes.
For Russians, the end of the fighting brought an instant of pure joy.
Ну что вам я могу сказать? В Берлине, в центре. Другой раз так забудешь, не вдумаешься глубоко, посмотришь. Напротив Рейхстаг, а здесь Бранденбургские ворота, которые Геббельс-то камнем, который заложил. Все равно прошли.
Berlin, the final battlefield. The capital of Hitler's Reich had fallen to the Red Army. Dazed Berliners waited to see what the conquerors would do to them. But there was no organized massacre. The survivors were allowed to live as best they could. Stalin even ordered his troops to feed the Berliners, but the soldiers looted homes, and all over the city they hunted down women.
More and more Russians came by. They looked through the window. Then one of them suddenly came in. I was babysitting. He took the child from my lap and gave it a toy and some cigarettes to play with. That was the first time I was raped. It was terrifying. Afterwards, I couldn't speak.
Stalin's police chief Beria and Foreign Minister Molotov tour Berlin. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, and each of the Allies took a sector of the German capital. The Allies had decided that Germany should compensate them for war damage.
Marshal Zhukov said, "We have fought long and hard. We've captured Berlin. We have the moral and legal right to take out as much as possible in reparations. We don't know what the future holds."
The German population was forced to help the Russians seize industrial resources. Not just machines. Thousands of craftsmen and scientists were kidnapped and taken to the Soviet Union. Central Europe was reverting to the Dark Ages. This was a space without law, shelter, or mercy. A continent of nomads. Millions of people uprooted by the Nazis were struggling home. Now it was the turn of the Germans to be the victims. From the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the victors were shaping Europe in their own image. Poland, the invaders' route to Russia, obsessed Stalin. Eastern Poland had been annexed by the Soviet Union. As compensation, the Allies shifted the whole country westward, giving Poland the eastern territories of Germany. The Germans were expelled. Poles, whose own homelands had been seized by the Soviet Union, now took over German farms and houses.
In the fall of 1945, a young Polish woman, 19 years old, and an older man from the militia entered our house.
Und ein älterer Mann von der Miliz unser Haus betreten. Sie fragt
The girl asked, "Who does this house belong to?" And my mother said, "To us."
Ja, mir. Und
And Hania, that was the Polish girl's name, said, "Now it's mine." From then on, it was Hania's house.
Von Hania. Morgens 6 Uhr.
6 in the morning, the militia came and banged the butts of their weapons against the door.
Und sagen raus.
Out.
Und jetzt, da habe ich als
Even though I
Kind
was
gemerkt,
only a child,
auch
I knew
als
this
Kind,
was
ich weiß
it.
es ganz genau. Jetzt ist es echt.
From all over Europe, some 12 million Germans were expelled from lands they had lived in for centuries. Today it's called ethnic cleansing. Then the Allies called it population transfer, and the British helped to move the Germans out. Victory in London. From 6 years of war, Britain emerged happy, but inwardly exhausted. For the moment, people cheered for king and empire as if nothing had changed or ever would. The king's new prime minister was Clement Attlee. The British voters had swung leftwards, and Churchill was out. In foreign policy, the new Labour government held tightly to the American alliance. Ernest Bevin, the new Foreign Secretary, was a trade union veteran who mistrusted communists. He had backed Churchill's intervention in the Greek Civil War. British interests were at stake here. The concern was that the conflict might threaten Britain's oil route from the Middle East through the Mediterranean. The strongest resistance movement, the Communists, reached for power. But they didn't know that Stalin had told Churchill that he had no interest in a communist Greece. The British army moved in. The Civil War was long and cruel. But Stalin kept his word and left the Greek communists to their fate. The Soviet Union now dominated the nations along its western border. At first, Stalin did not impose a Soviet system on his new empire. Instead, he built up pro-Soviet coalition governments, but the communists made sure that the police and security were in their hands. The Yalta Conference had given Russia control of Central Europe.
We knew perfectly well what the Russians interpreted as democracy and all that, but then we were allies fighting a war together. We couldn't very well say to Stalin, now we are going to write down our interpretation of Western democracy and you've got to sign up and say this is your interpretation. It wasn't possible.
We began to receive cables from American representatives in what we were all later to call the satellite countries on the behavior of Soviet troops with respect to the people of Poland, of Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, and so on. So trouble was in the air.
What would happen is that such and such a prominent member of the Peasant Party of Bulgaria would be kidnapped, simply would disappear. Or other figures who were not acceptable for inclusion in People's Democratic new regimes would be disappeared.
In Berlin, where the Allies jointly supervised city life, the communists were careful.
The idea was at the beginning to cooperate and gradually to build up the party, making the best organized party, the most militant party, the most active party, and gradually increase the influence on the other parties, and gradually take over the whole situation, but not at once. We should already prepare for building up the police. The man for personnel, changes personnel. The man for education. So we were flabbergasted. We only 3 or 4 comrades and everybody else are social democrats and bourgeois democrats and so on. So one of us asked and said, it must look democratic, but we must have everything in our hands.
Many Germans perfectly well understood that brown, the Nazi colors, were becoming red overnight. After all, the methods in some ways were the same, or at any rate very similar, of forcing people to do things against their will.
For me, my only comparison was always the Soviet Union under Stalin. And comparable to the Soviet Union under Stalin, 1935 to 45, 45 to 46, 47 in Germany was wonderful. It was much less terror than which I had witnessed the 10 years before in the Soviet Union.
Soviet communism had stood the test of war. The Red Army was the biggest on earth, and General Eisenhower came to pay his respects to the world's newest superpower. But Stalin feared encirclement by the capitalist powers. At home, he watched for treachery. Those who had been taken prisoner by the Germans and seen a glimpse of the West might become disloyal. They were being arrested in thousands. The Americans knew what was going on.
We had a maid whose husband was a prisoner of war. When he finally was repatriated and came back, it was this great reunion. Life was wonderful again. The family was reunited. 6 months later, he was arrested because he had been a German prisoner of war.
Some were there because of a general decree by Stalin. Some were deserters and thieves. Some White Russian emigres. Some Poles from the Home Army. I entered a whole new world. Prison camps were my university.
Poland. In the wreckage of Warsaw, the Poles began to clear the ruins. The Poles had fought the Germans on every front, east and west. Now they worked together to rebuild their country. Some loathed the new semi-communist government tied to Moscow, but others found reasons to accept it and live with it.
The most important thing for me was for my mother and sister to come from Siberia, and for us to begin rebuilding the country. We also needed to secure our borders, which were seriously threatened. Staying in the army gave me that chance.
In Moscow, Poland's new puppet leaders were taken to the opera. The Poles agreed to a close alliance with the Soviet Union. Stalin promised to defend the new Polish frontiers against any German attempt to win back the lost territories. Stalin was at the zenith of his power. His colleagues felt terror in his presence.
Russian diplomats, like all other Russian officials or party members or whatever, lived in terror of the great man, and justifiably so, because if they gave unpopular advice, they might find themselves in a concentration camp or with a bullet in the back of their heads. It wasn't very easy to give good advice to Stalin. It was unpalatable.
Он сидел такой веселый, настроение у него хорошее, рядом сидел с ним.
Stalin was cheerful and in high spirits. At his side were the main guest, the interpreter, and Soviet guests too.
Другие гости, наши, все так. И когда раздавали официанты там какой-то...
The waiters came in with the main course.
То или
I think it was turkey.
То один официант, когда наливал...
One of them, whilst he was pouring the sauce, dropped some red liquid on Stalin's sand-colored jacket.
На этот китель, да, красный такой, жидкость, эту самый сок красный, да, и этот он как струйка крови, знаете, так потекла по всему этому красивому, нарядному, торжественному мундиру.
They were in a state of shock about what would happen, because the stains looked like drops of blood.
Замерли в испуге, что будет вообще.
But Stalin didn't react. He continued to talk with his neighbor. Then another waiter came up to him with some water and offered to sponge it out. But Stalin said, no, no, and he was absolutely calm. People saw that things seemed to be okay. Everyone began eating again, and the routine continued.
To mark the Soviet elections, Stalin made a grand appearance. To his exhausted people, he promised no rewards, but only more effort, more 5-year plans for heavy industry. Then, in cloudy words, he warned that capitalism and imperialism made future wars inevitable. Did this mean war between the Soviet Union and the West? Abroad, alarm bells rang.
I read the speech with care and interpreted it as being a delayed declaration of war against the United States. Wasn't any doubt about it if you read the text carefully, what he was talking about.
The speech was interpreted in the West as no less than a prediction of World War III. I don't think this was right, though.
Но я думаю, что это вряд ли правильно. Во всяком случае,
Stalin didn't say anything new or different in that speech.
Сталин не сказал.
He said what he had always believed, that with imperialism and capitalism, war was inevitable.
С империализмом, с капитализмом неизбежно.
What the Russians were thinking in terms of was that, and I think Stalin thought in these terms, was that communism was one day going to rule, be the dominant ideology in the world, and all countries gradually were going to become communist. And in the meantime, you didn't, in Stalin's idea, start dangerous wars which you might lose, but if you had a good chance of pushing the cause along, you always pushed it along.
Stalin had relaxed his dictatorship during the war, but now he was tightening it once more. The Soviet Union's obvious suspicion of the West disturbed Washington. An American diplomat in Moscow, George Kennan, was asked what he thought was going on.
When they finally sent me a telegram expressing their astonishment and concern because the Russians were dragging their feet about joining the International Bank, I thought, well, for goodness sake, I can't answer that in one question. They're going to have to give me space. And I sat down and tried to give a picture of this government as it emerged from the war.
One of the strengths of Kennan was his awareness that the Russia in which we were living, Stalin's Soviet Russia, communism, people called it, actually drew in very many ways upon the Russian past.
I had to go right back to page 1 and to try to tell them things that I felt they'd forgotten during the war. This all hangs together with this whole question that this was the same group of people who had dealt with Hitler, had tried to deal with Hitler at our expense, and never had changed their views about us.
Kennan's Moscow embassy cable became history, an 8,000-word prophecy that the Soviet Union was in the mood to expand across the world and must be contained.
The day that telegram was drafted, I unfortunately or fortunately had the night duty at the code room and was rather perturbed about it because I happened to have a very heavy date that night. There was a dance at one of the other embassies, and I wanted to get out as early as possible. About 6:30 or 7, George comes walking in with this 6-part cable which he wants to send out. And I took a look at it and I said it was nice, but let's not send it out. Let's wait till tomorrow. And I tried to talk him into not sending it. He said, Washington wants it, they're going to get it, and you stay here and do it.
Kennan's telegram alarmed Washington. Days later, its message was reinforced when Churchill arrived in the United States as President Truman's guest.
They began to get to know each other. Our president said to Mr. Churchill, I will be on this trip quite a while, and I would be glad if you would call me Harry. Well, Mr. Churchill said, I'll be glad to if you will call me Winston. Mr. Truman said, I don't believe I can do that. He said, I consider you the first citizen in the world, and I just don't believe I can call you Winston. Winston Churchill said, if you can't call me Winston, then I can't call you Harry. The president said, on that basis, we'll do it. So it went Winston and Harry from that time, and they got on very well.
Churchill was due to speak to a college audience at Fulton in Truman's home state. Privately, he showed Truman what he was going to say. The president, not sure that the American public was ready for an attack on its wartime Soviet ally, let Churchill test the water.
Mr. Churchill, he's one of the great men of the age. He's a great Englishman. He's a great Englishman, but he's half American.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Except in the British Commonwealth and in the United States, where communism is in its infancy, the Communist parties, or fifth columns, constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization. Whatever conclusions may be drawn from these facts, in fact they are, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace.
Immediately after that, Stalin came out with answers to a foreign correspondent's questions in which he compared Churchill to Hitler and decried Churchill's speech as a belligerent call to arms against Soviet Russia.
Since 1945, America had been extending its influence and power all over the world. Stalin grew nervous. He put pressure on Turkey to grant the Soviet Union a military presence in the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. America and Britain feared a threat to the Suez Canal. They were determined to keep Turkey free of Soviet interference. When the Turkish ambassador in Washington died suddenly, Truman used America's biggest battleship, the USS Missouri, to deliver the body to Istanbul.
This was a symbol to Stalin. Don't push us, and don't push Turkey, because if you push Turkey, we'll be there.
Iran, like Turkey, lay on the southern borders of the Soviet Union, and for centuries had been hostile to Russia. During the war, Soviet and British troops had occupied Iran to protect their oil supplies. They even celebrated their partnership there. The old Shah, thought to be pro-German, was dethroned and replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. There was an agreement that once the war was over, the British and Soviet troops would both pull out.
When the occupation was due to end, Stalin didn't want to leave.
У Сталина охоты уходить из Ирана не было. Он, так сказать,
He wanted to stay on.
и задержаться бы еще.
This created problems. There was lots of pressure put on us, pressure from the British. And in fact, the Soviet Union had no legal right to stay there.
Iran presented the Security Council of the newly founded United Nations with its first crisis.
That's Mr. Gromyko proposing to the Security Council that the hearing of the Persian case should be postponed.
The Soviet Union tried to prevent further discussion. They lost.
Mr. Gromyko and the other Russians then walked out. Their dramatic exit seems to have caused no obvious reaction at the time, though we can imagine what most of those present were thinking. One good thing, however, emerges from this incident. The Security Council had stood its ground.
6 weeks later, Stalin ceremonially withdrew his forces from Iran. But Truman, shaken by his behavior, suspected that Stalin was aiming at world domination.
He said, I want to be in position to document our concern. Go back over the recent agreements and list one by one the violations in which the Soviets have engaged.
I was then Mr. Clifford's assistant, and he turned the task over to me. We talked about it a bit, and I said, well, it seems to me that that's only scratching the surface. A list of agreements broken. This is a much more there are much more fundamental problems in our relations with the USSR than that. So let's go at it in a somewhat broader way.
We spent weeks on it then, interviewed most of the top officials in the United States.
There was absolute unanimity in all of the agencies concerned as to the nature of problems we had and the kind of response we were going to have to make.
We ended up the report by saying, the policy of our country should be set and clearly set. The Soviet Union constitutes a real menace to freedom in this world. Freedom in Europe, freedom in the United States. So we must prepare for it.
The Clifford-Elsie report was kept secret. The report concluded that a war with the USSR would be more total, more horrible than anything previously known. The United States still had the monopoly of atomic weapons. At Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, 2 atom bombs were detonated in July 1946. The warning to Stalin was plain. From now on, all the big powers worked frantically to develop their own atomic and biological weapons. At the Paris Conference of Foreign Ministers, Molotov was determined to maintain joint Allied control of Germany. But his American counterpart, Secretary of State Burns, wanted Germany to pay no more reparations. For Molotov, Burns was too concerned with German opinion. He was outraged.
Molotov was nicknamed Mr. No. But if he had been a Mr. Yes, Stalin would not have kept him on. Stalin needed a Mr. No, someone capable of finding out the maximum information about the other side's position. Molotov would squeeze the other side to its absolute limit. When he had totally exhausted these methods, it was Stalin's turn. He would come back and resolve matters with a friendly smile.
It was at Paris that the wartime alliance began finally to break up. The Americans and the British were impatient to develop stable economies in their zones of Germany without Soviet interference.
Stuttgart, Germany.
scene of an event that marks a new phase in Europe's destiny. Secretary of State James F. Burns is here to set forth the policy of the United States on Germany, a speech widely interpreted as marking the end of America's appeasement of Russia. Burns tells the Germans and the world,
"It is not in the interest of the German people or in the interest of world peace that Germany should become a pawn or a partner in a military struggle for power between the East and the West."
I listened to the Burns-Stuttgart speech with marked approval because, in fact, I had written most of it. And those of us who worked on it, and Burns, were not thinking in anti-Soviet terms.
The American people want to return the government of Germany to the people of Germany. The American people want to help the German people to win their way back to an honorable place among the free and peace-loving nations of the world.
In 1945, the Allies had approved Poland's annexation of Germany's eastern provinces up to the Oder and Neisse rivers. But now Burns suggested that the new frontier was unfair to Germany and might be changed.
It was a shocking statement. It made us think that our western border was being questioned by the Germans and by other Western countries.
Jest I będzie kwestionowana przez mocarstwa zachodnie, przez Niemcy.
It was one of the most important things that strengthened our ties with the Soviet Union.
Umacniał nasze sojusznicze stosunki ze Związkiem Radzieckim.
More pictures have arrived from Moscow. They show the everyday scene in the Soviet capital's famous Red Square. And what's in their shops? Well, here's a glimpse of the sort of things now on display. These new fashions, our cameraman tells us, are so expensive that they're quite beyond the means of ordinary people in Russia today.
Ordinary people were much worse off than the newsreels showed.
It was a very hard time. I had a son who was 1.5 years old. He used to get a plate from the cupboard and walk after me saying, "Give me, give me." But I had nothing to give him. We used to go to the market and buy horse feed.
On the collective farms, war damage and the death of so many workers at the front were deepening a grave food shortage.
I took a trip down through the Ukraine, and it was the time of the 47 famine that was going on down there, about which nothing was heard in the outside world. Soviets were talking about great grain harvests and everything else. We got down there, on the train stops you would see children with distended bellies begging for bread. At the out in Odessa itself, people lying out on the streets outside the hospitals where they couldn't take them in, starving to death. There was malnutrition everywhere.
In Germany, too, hunger and disease were spreading. The nightmare of the Western Allies was that poverty would drive the Germans towards communism.
There was never enough food. We were always hungry. In those days, we went on scavenging trips. We went to farmers and begged. Sometimes we got something, other times nothing.
America's General Lucius Clay reflected, "There is no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000. Aid to Germany cost Britain over $1 million a day. But British supplies were not enough to save thousands of Germans who died that winter for lack of food and fuel. Britain too was weakening. The fierce winter of 1946-47 brought industry to a standstill. The country's economy, undermined by 6 years of war, began to seize up. Coal ran out, electricity failed, and food rationing grew even tighter.
You know, people forget again, we never had bread rationing during the war. We had bread rationing after it. And that was because we were pouring wheat into Germany to prevent mass starvation there.
That was a bad winter altogether. It was cold and crops were bad. People were unhappy. And the communists were making strenuous gains here, there, and the other place, particularly in Italy and in France, but also in Germany.
The British could no longer afford all their heavy commitments in the Mediterranean. They told the Americans they intended to pull out.
The message came, and it was flat. It said, Great Britain is withdrawing from both economic aid and military aid to Greece and Turkey.
This simply crystallized the opinions in the executive branch that the United States had to move, and move very, very quickly.
The prospect didn't look good at all for Europe or for the United States or for anybody.
In Washington, President Truman went to Congress. From now on, he announced, the United States would contain the advance of communism anywhere on the globe. This, at last, was the official declaration of the Cold War.